Hello everyone and welcome back to another video on the channel. Today we're going to be finishing off my 13 Days of Halloween series with the Cabinet of Curiosities, brought to us by Guillermo del Toro, who does a nice little intro to every single episode, and it has a great, just lineup of directors directing each and every single episode of this anthology series. And this is right up my alley because I love horror, I love anthologies, and I love just like small contained stories that are all just perfectly wrapped up by the end of each episode, and this is exactly what this is. So we're going to be ranking all 8 episodes of Cabinet of Curiosities. So if you have not seen this series, that I highly recommend it, especially since it is Halloween. Happy Halloween, everybody. And of course, we are going to be getting into spoilers for all of these episodes, so let's just jump right into this thing. So the first one that we are going to be talking about is Lot 36. This is the first episode of the series, directed by Guillermo Navarro, and I will say that Guillermo del Toro did a great job at choosing each and every single director for the series because they all had their own personal stamp and style and type of storytelling that they wanted to do for every single one of these episodes. So in that way, I don't think that any of these episodes are necessarily bad. So even though this is at the bottom of my list, I do think that this one has a lot of great qualities to it as well. So let's get over the negatives of this episode right off the bat. And I will say that Tim Blake Nelson does a good job as a performer because, he's doing exactly what is on the page. He's doing what the director is telling him to do. He's playing a very unlikable character. It's just, for me, for this character in particular, I just hated him so much to a point where it was no longer enjoyable. It just got to a point where it was so under my skin. It got so much on my nerves that I just was rejecting him as main character so much. And I guess you're supposed to, but it was just so frustrating. I really hated him with a passion. But I will say that this episode is good in terms of the direction, in terms of where the story goes, and the kind of like supernatural elements that are brought into the story. So I will say the story of this episode of Tim Blake Nelson kind of digging through all these different items in the storage locker to try to pawn all of them off and finding these 3 books, and these 3 books have this sort of value to him, so he's very greedy in terms of getting the money for all of these things. But there's a lot more to this storage location than you can see by the entire thing, because the back of it has a door and it has this tunnel, it has this whole thing that's a ritual in the back, and it's just very creepy. And I will say that the designs of the creature by the end of this episode was by far the best part. It was very creepy, it's very disturbing, and when he's running around the hallways and the lights are turning off because you have to crank on the lights, it was a very great use of location. It was well directed, and Tim Blake Nelson was, I guess, more bearable in this part of the episode because I was rooting for him to die, and it was kind of like the whole point of it. And when that one lady locks him out from the outside, it was so very fitting for his character and his demise. So in that way, this episode was enjoyable, and that's, the way that it built up to this thing by the end of it was entertaining. And so that way, the director did put together a good piece. I was just so frustrated by that main character that it made me hard to really love this episode. The next episode on my ranking list is going to be Dreams in the Witch House, directed by Catherine Hardwicke, starring Rupert Grint from Harry Potter. And this one, of course, is, from the director of Twilight, which I think is an interesting choice. And I do think that this episode, like the first one, is very well directed, and I think that it has a stylistic stamp from the director that is very evident. It is based on a writing from H.P. Lovecraft as well, so the story has some interesting twists and turns to it that is kind of interesting in general. And I did like Rupert Grint a lot in this show. I think he's a great actor. He's great in Servant, which is M. Night Shyamalan's show, so he's been doing some stuff in the genre recently that I've really been enjoying. And I think the concept of this like forest of all these lost souls is very interesting, and Rupert Grint's kind of drive to kind of save his sister was interesting. I just wasn't as drawn into this episode as some of the other ones, because I think some of the other episodes are just, they excel so much in either character or in terms of the style or in terms of like the horror aspects of it, where this one didn't really scare me too much. Had some interesting ideas, has a character and a drive of that character that is interesting, but it wasn't as I wasn't as invested in this one as I was with all the other ones on this list. So this one kind of falls down the rankings because of the other ones being so good, and this one I just think is a fine episode. It wasn't as scary as even the last one that I just talked about, so I think that's probably the biggest negative of this one, is just the horror of it didn't really work too well. But I was glad that this director got a chance to make her film that has her stamp to it, because I really do think that it has a good stamp to it. And Rupert Grint, of course, was great. I just don't think this one stood out when I kind of take a step back and look at the whole grand scheme of this series. So the next one on my list is going to be Pickman's Model, directed by Keith Thomas, starring Crispin Glover, which is really cool to see Crispin Glover, back acting again, because I think he's taken a break in a while, or maybe I just haven't seen him in a while, just in anything really. To see him in the show was a nice little surprise. But I will say that Keith Thomas is a great director, and I think he's a very interesting director because he did The Vigil not too long ago, and I love that movie. But then he did Firestarter, which I think that one is more of a consequence of studio meddling. I think that is what brought that movie down so low, especially it's one of my least favorite of the year so far. So this short is more in line with what I think of him as a director. I will say that Crispin Glover's performance in this episode really does elevate it above the last 2 episodes that I have talked about. He is so weird in this episode. His performance, his accent is bizarre, his movements are bizarre, and his just like performance is very drawing. You're very drawn to his character, and you just can't keep your eyes off of him whenever he's on screen. And I do think that Keith Thomas's direction in this episode is so damn good because you can just tell his stamp is so firmly on this entire short. And the vigil, when you see those candlelit scenes in this episode and in the vigil, especially the poster of the vigil, you can tell it's a Keith Thomas thing, which I get why they got him for Firestarter because of the fire. But when you see these sort of scenes, especially towards the end of the episode, and you see this creature design at the end of it, which was incredible, and you have this storyline of all these paintings with this other character and how just kind of weird it is and how interesting the story is and how original it is. I think that is what makes this episode so much better than the other two. It's just the performances, the originality, and the direction are very, very solid in this. And this is when we get into some of the episodes of the show that are very much standouts. Alright, the next episode I want to talk about in this ranking is going to be Vincenzo Natali's episode called Graveyard Rats. And he's such a fascinating director because he has films like Cube, which I really, really do like Cube. And then he has a film like Splice, which is just... it's Splice. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. It's just weird and it does not stick the landing by the end of it, but it has always interesting ideas, and I think this episode handles that type of storyline that the first episode tried to do with that unlikable character that's going to get his comeuppance by the end of the episode very, very well, and I think this one is definitely a short compared to the other ones. This episode is only 38 minutes long, and when you take out the credits and you take out, Guillermo del Toro's little intro at the beginning of the shorts, it's honestly just a very effective 30-minute short film that is just very perfect and very efficient in its scares, and it kind of builds up this character to be very unlikable because he is a grave robber. He's doing all these things that are just kind of nasty and disgusting. He's very greedy. And when it comes to the ending of this short, when you see these graveyard rats that are just disgusting, these rats that are crawling all over him are just, it's very terrifying. It's very claustrophobic when he's crawling through these tunnels, and when he sees the giant rat, it's genuinely terrifying. When he gets further down there and this like half skeleton thing is crawling after him like a zombie, it's like, what is going on in this thing? It's very creepy. It's very, very effective. I think this is one of the scarier episodes in this entire series, and I just think that I'm very impressed with the director and the writing and the performances and just everything involved in this episode. The production design, the visual effects, everything. It is so perfectly well done for this very efficient episode. So now that we're in my top 4 of this list, it's going to be very hard for me to choose which one comes next, especially for these next 3. I think they're very interchangeable on this ranking list. And after rewatch, I honestly could like one of these more than the other. I think that some of these episodes I really do want to come back to. And these top 4 are definitely ones I'm going to watch often. So this next one is going to be The Viewing, directed by Panos Cosmatos, the director of Mandy. And I will say that Mandy, I have a controversial opinion on that movie, which maybe I'll review it one day, but I think the first half is incredibly boring. It took me 2 times to watch this movie because I couldn't get past the first hour of the movie. But then the last hour of that movie is just incredible and brings that movie up to such great levels, and that's what I was expecting from all the hype that I heard from that film. And so this director makes a lot of just weird and unique choices with his films, and I will say that the second you turn this one on, you can tell it's from the director of Mandy, and as it goes on and as the dialogue continues, with all this great ensemble of characters, it just gets weirder and weirder and weirder, and the end of the short with this alien creature thing that they're viewing is just so bizarre, and people's faces start melting, and just the visual look of this episode is probably my favorite of all of them. It's very unique, it's very futuristic and sci-fi, even though it's very grounded in these conversations, which I think that the dialogue in this one is also great. The entire cast is great in this thing. It's really cool to see Eric Andre in this thing, but Peter Weller steals the entire thing. His voice and his performance as this guy who has kind of brought all these different characters together is very, very soothing. I was just always drawn and kind of hypnotized by his entire performance, and really everybody's performance in this entire episode, and it does help that the director is a very hypnotic and kind of ethereal director. This one very feels like it feels like an acid trip the entire time, and I love it for that. Alright, and the number 3 on my list is going to be The Outside, which this one I think is going to be one of the more controversial episodes in this. I can see somebody absolutely hating this, and I scrolled through all the reviews on Letterboxd, and I saw a lot of people just trashing this one. Somebody even said that it was a very poor filmmaker, it felt very amateur, and that's I will wholeheartedly disagree with. I think this one was one of the most uniquely directed episodes. It's directed by Ana Lily Amirpour, who directed A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, and that film is very unique. It's very original in terms of a vampire story, and she, as a director, is very interesting. The ideas that she throws in her films are very interesting as well. This film very much plays on the idea of beauty standards for women in our world, and so I think in that way, this episode is very fascinating. I think the use of the wide-angle lenses, especially when the main character is interacting with all the other women that work at her bank, is so just uncomfortable and cringy in the best ways possible. I was so uncomfortable watching this entire short film in a very different way than I was uncomfortable watching Graveyard Rats. That one was just disgusting and made you want your skin to crawl because it's just gross critters running all over you. But this one is just characters talking and being obnoxious and like the skin being irritated because of all this lotion that she's using, and it's just like all of it's peeling off, and it's just like you want to jump out of your skin watching this thing because of that direction, because of the use of those wide angle lenses, and because of the story and how wrapped up you are. And even Dan Stevens has a very odd and just strange performance as this guy on TV that is just very like investing. I was so invested in this episode. I think when it comes to all of these different episodes, this one was the most unique because it didn't feel as, you know, horror as some of the other episodes, which maybe that's why this one is going to be more controversial, because it is horrific in a very different type of way. And I think that is why I loved it so much. And I do think that this episode has my favorite performance from every single episode. The main actress was just so damn good in this, and just her entire journey throughout this movie, I was kind of like, I felt bad for her because she was coming to all the beauty standards that the world is kind of pushing upon her, especially with Dan Stevens' character. But when it comes to the husband of this movie and how frustrating he got towards the end of it, and when she killed him, I was like, good for you. You're breaking out of these standards, and now he's trying to push onto you. And so I didn't know by the end of it if I was supposed to be happy for her or if I was supposed to be sad for her. And it's just like, it's so complex, and it's one of those things where you just have to make up your own mind of how the character is kind of grown throughout the entire film and how this ending is supposed to affect you. And so in that way, I think it's a very interesting one to think about. And again, I was very uncomfortable and cringing in this episode in a very different way of horror than all the other episodes. At number 2 is going to be The Murmuring, directed by Jennifer Kent, the director of The Babadook, and I absolutely love The Babadook. I think that is one of the strongest horror films in recent years. It is absolutely terrifying. I watched it in theaters the other day, and it was phenomenal. I really do love that one. And this one, I think, feels very in line with something that Mike Flanagan would do, because this one has that creepy haunted house feel of these characters, you know, bird watching in this creepy old mansion with, you know, this history of this woman and her child, and you don't really know what's going on with her, and it's kind of her going mad in this house alone. It's a lot of that creeping in the middle of the night, you know, hearing noises, seeing like figures, this child running around, or hearing the giggles or the laughs or the cries of these different characters that have died in this home. And so it feels like a normal haunted house movie, but it's elevated by all the emotion and all the just the ideas of grief in this episode. And so when I say it reminds me of Mike Flanagan, it's because all these ghosts have a reason. They all have a sort of sadness to them. It's this kid and this acceptance of, you know, him realizing that he's dead and having to run to light by the end of the episode that almost had me in tears. And this idea of this main character played by Essie Davis from The Babadook is so great because you can just see the grief in her eyes and the fact that she doesn't know what to do with it because she lost her own child. And so now she's dealing with the idea of this kid here and trying to let him set free, so when she is able to set these people free, then she can kind of open up to her own grief, and she is now free of all that. And the way that it all kind of ties in thematically with the bird watching and all the murmurings and all of those things with the birds, it's a very fascinating episode. It's probably the best written episode in this entire series. I really love the script of this one. It was very, very solid. And the creepy stuff at night, which is so well directed, and it was very well done. Even though some of these things might sound cliche to you, I don't mind cliches or just tropes in horror movies if it's done effectively. And I think this one, again, with that directorial stamp from Jennifer Kent and that way that she's able to weave horror into her more emotional and in-depth stories about grief, it's just phenomenal. And I love The Babadook, and I now love this episode. This one will be one that I rewatch very often. I loved the script and the writing and the performances and just everything about this one. And Andrew Lincoln dancing, what does this episode not have? And last but not least is, I think, the standout for everybody who has watched any of these episodes, and that is episode 3, The Autopsy. This one's directed by David Pryor, who did The Empty Man, which is a very underrated horror movie. I think it's still on HBO Max. I think you guys should check it out. It failed at the box office, and it got very negative reviews, but it's honestly a very strong horror film, and this one even more so. I thought this episode was brilliant. This episode stars F. Murray Abraham, who voiced Khonshu in Moon Knight, which I absolutely love the fact that he's in this show, and he's just him. He's a coroner, so he's going to do all these autopsies on this incident that happened in these mines of these, you know, people were disappearing, and the cops kind of found this guy, and he ran down, and there's an explosion, and we don't know what exactly happened to cause all these things, to cause all 10 of these people to die. So he starts doing all the autopsies on all these people to find out that the guy who caused the explosion is kind of infected with possibly this creature from outer space, this alien, that is just very fascinating. And where some of these episodes are more simple haunting episodes, or some of them were monster movies, or some of them were dialogue driven, just weird trippy acid trips, this one was more of a psychological battle between F. Murray Abraham and this alien. And that when they get laid on the autopsy table and this alien is cutting itself out of the body that's currently in to enter into F. Murray Abraham's body, and you have that entire sequence of them trying to outsmart each other, the script is very smart. And when it gets to the ending and just just everything that happens in the design of this alien and just how disturbing it is watching all these autopsies, and the practical effects within this episode is just some of the best I've seen in quite a while. And I will say that this episode, along with all the other episodes in this entire thing, definitely have a kind of a stamp and feel that Guillermo del Toro gives to all of the projects that he works on. And so this episode even more so feels very del Toro. It feels very much like the Empty Man and that director and what he loves to do in his films. And so it was the perfect encapsulation of what this series could do for this entire season and for the future. I really hope they do a second season to get more of these directors putting their own stamp to it, having a very Guillermo del Toro feel, a very original story that these things wouldn't be made unless it was for this show. And so that is my ranking of all 8 episodes in the series, The Cabinet of Curiosities. It is on Netflix right now, and I definitely think you guys should watch it for Halloween, or even though Halloween's over already, just go watch it for other things. It's a very great horror series with a lot of great directors that have put their stamp on each and every single episode, and I think every single one of them is worth your time. So what did you think of Cabinet of Curiosities? How would you rank all the episodes in your own personal opinions? Comment down below, let me know all of your thoughts on all of these episodes. So if you enjoyed this video and the 13 Days of Halloween series that I've been doing all of October, definitely subscribe to the channel to see more things like this. I will continue to do this next year, next October. I love doing this series for you guys. And also, I'm going to be reviewing stuff all throughout the entire fall movie season. So we're going to be getting into some Oscar movies. Black Panther is about to come out, so there's a lot of stuff to keep looking forward to on this channel. So definitely subscribe, leave a like, comment down below your thoughts on the series, and I hope to see you all in my next one.